everyone. It's always a pleasure to be at the conferences of the FTTH. It's, I think, my fourth or fifth one, so I'm super happy to be here. And thank you for inviting me. I'm also replacing here Director General Viola, who is also sending his best wishes. Indeed, the discussions that are ongoing on Omnibus and other aspects are keeping him busy in Brussels. But I have a pleasure to talk about the work that we have done together. We have done with industry, we have done with stakeholders, but mostly we have done, of course, was done by the team that I am managing, the connectivity team in DigiConnect, which is the Digital Networks Act. I will also refer a bit to the Cybersecurity Act on some aspects, because many aspects are relevant for the overall picture of what we wanted to do, and Francesco very nicely pointed it out. I also just want to say that I'm also very happy to be back in London after a long time that I haven't been here. There are many reasons for that, also because I started my journey in telecom regulation here in the UK, studying the regulation and liberalization and regulatory aspects in the UK, and this is where I learned the business, and this is how I came back now to connectivity, and I have pleasure to work on these aspects at the EU level. On the topic of my keynote, Advancing Europe's Digital Agenda Through Fibre Connectivity, I want to pinpoint to many elements, but I will start maybe with very important one related with why we came with Digital Networks Act in first place, and why we propose the changes and new regulatory framework for connectivity. I think they can be summarized in three key objectives that we also added to the framework clearly right now, which are competitiveness, very much promoted and initiated by a report that Professor Draghi prepared. Second, very, very important, and I am also very glad that we had opportunity to listen to Professor Letta, single market dimension, which is absolutely essential in the connectivity markets currently in the EU. And third one, which was also sponsored by the report of former Prime Minister Inisto, resilience and preparedness of the networks, that also was very much mentioned by Francesco, and very rightly so. These are really the three objectives that we always need to keep in mind when we look at the connectivity and where we are heading. It's true that the situation, as Professor Letta mentioned, is very hectic geopolitically. We are living in very much changing world. But in order to achieve what we want to achieve in the long term, in the midterm, we really need to be on track. We really need to think in terms of the bigger objectives and the bigger goals. We need single market for the EU. We need it in connectivity. There is absolutely no doubt for it. We need competitiveness. We need competition as well in this market. Digital networks, connectivity is really essence of the future economy, of the current economy, but also very much future economy and society. And this is what we are doing together. But these networks will need to be resilient, will need to be prepared. So that's why these three objectives are also something that is going as a thread through the two acts that we prepared, Digital Networks Act and Cyber Security Act. It doesn't mean that we give up on the very important other objectives of the regulatory framework. As you had seen, we kept very important objectives related to protection of consumers in particular and users, because at the end of the day, what we are doing for end users, we are doing for consumers, and we are doing for industry and economy. We also kept very important aspect related to competition. We want to build competition, and we would like to act in competitive markets in the EU. And we also kept very important provisions related to the single market, but putting much more emphasis on this one. So the objective, really one of the main objectives of the Digital Network Act, is the single market. So I will start with single market. I will briefly mention also very important aspects related to the resilience, and then I would like to move to the topic on the agenda, which is basically what we are doing under DNA for fiber connectivity, and how the copper switch off proposal included in DNA is relevant and very important for that. So first, very important subject that we were trying to build through in the DNA is single market. we have been experiencing since the beginning of the regulatory framework. We're trying to move point by point with different reforms towards the single market. But I think the biggest problem that we identified when we did the assessment of the current framework of the code was golden plating, very different regulations, the way the code, the regulatory framework so far had been implemented in the EU. Very different environments in which the operators were operating in different member states. So basically, instead of one regulatory framework, similar conditions for all telecom operators, but also for consumers and users, we were facing 27 national markets with 27 national regulatory regimes. And this is, I think, one of the biggest problems that we identified in the evaluation, which also led us to looking into the measures that we can take in order to remedy this. And the first measure, very obvious and very much underlined by Professor Letta, is to change from directive to regulation. I think it's absolutely essential. I think it would be a game changer, first of all, in terms of delivery and basically placing these rules in the market. It would be much quicker. And the second thing, it would be a uniform approach. So we are very strongly proposing and defending our proposal on regulation. We don't want to be in the situation that the co-legislators might decide, mostly for the national reasons, that this is not the right instrument. It is the right instrument. It's time for regulation. And the regulation, the way we draft it, is clear enough to be implemented and have the direct implementation into the national regimes. I will not mention all single market related measures that we propose under DNA. There are really many. We really, when we were drafting the proposal, we were really thinking from the point of view, what is missing, what should be done more at the European level, what should be also a more single market approach. But I will mention two which I think are very interesting. Single loop passporting authorization regime that we proposed, allowing basically operators to provide networks and services in various member states just based on one notification in one member state. So I think it's a very important measure. It's also a very symbolical measure. It also very nicely links with the 28 regime that Professor Letta was mentioning. The second one, less maybe relevant for the fiber perspective, but I think very important to mention, is that we are first time proposing EU-level satellite spectrum authorization. And this is really game changer, and this is also one of the aspects that we strongly believe it's European aspect. No, it's not possible for each member state to authorize spectrum for the satellites. It's really necessary to do it together for different reasons, economic, competitiveness, but also very much security and sovereignty. So these are the two measures that I want to mention, but I would like also now to move to fiber connectivity, which is also very much in the proposal and one of the most important chapters. But before I mention this, I would like to pause and tell you how we were preparing this proposal, because I think it's very important to understand what kind of work went into this proposal. First of all, we started very much with consulting with stakeholders 3 years ago. I think it was the explanatory consultation and different stages of preparation of these proposals. We have done very thorough evaluation of the current framework. And last but not least, we also prepared impact assessment where we assess for the most fundamental parts of the proposal when we propose the biggest changes. So basically spectrum, authorization, fixed networks, and finally also the governance that is needed to be changed in order to develop and prepare for the single market approach. We have provided evidence and analysis. We look at the problems, what kind of problems we are facing, why we are facing them, so what are the problem drivers, what can be done to solve these problems, what options we have. And this is something that I'm also very proud of in the context of fiber and copper switch off, because if you look into the impact assessment, you will see the full analysis from the problems to the solutions proposed and why we propose the solutions. So one of the reasons that we proposed copper switch off and change in regulatory regime for access is based simply on data. Some of the data were shown here before. I will refer to the latest data from the Digital Decade report, which are concentrating on the 27 member states and are still from the last year. We are preparing the report for this year, and it will come in June, so we'll see also new data. But measure that we use in the report is basically fiber to the premises. And under this measure, we had in 2024 69% coverage in the EU. What is important to say that our predictions for the FTTP are that by 2030, which is also, as you remember, the current deadline for the gigabit connectivity target, we will reach, or you will reach, around 90% of premises in the EU. However, if we would keep business as usual, something that Professor Letta was also mentioning we should never do, this is not the current situation, this is not the current climate, we need to do more rather than less. The full 100% coverage would be only reached in 2051, and I'm here talking about FTTP, I'm not talking about FTTH, which gives you also indication that even more needs to be done. Very important element that we also look into is indeed very low take-up in the EU. Of course, it differs between the member states, but it also requires very concrete measures that we are also proposing in the proposal. The second important element is digital urban divide, which still very much exists in the EU. Looking at the data from the Digital Decade report, we are talking about 60% of households living in rural areas were reached by the fiber in 2024. So the gap still remains, and in some countries, this gap is 50 percentage points between the rural and urban areas. So this is very significant disadvantage for the economy, for end users and society. This last thing, which is also very much related to single market dimension, the coverage is very, very much diverse in the member states. Francesco mentioned and showed the map showing which countries are lagging behind. I think it was also very much visible, but it's also visible from our assessment in the impact assessment of the DNA. It's Austria, Greece, Czechia, Germany, and Belgium. So, taking all this into account, and also looking at regulatory approaches, successful stories in terms of regulatory approaches and economic choices in different member states, our response to that was proposal of transition to fiber. So basically, orderly, predictable copper switch off with very concrete plan, with very concrete roles for you in first place, for operators, because that would be your role to fill in, and for some of the operators to speed up the already ongoing transition and switching off of the copper networks. But also very concretely recognizing the roles between the Commission, the European level, where we are trying to push it to make sure that it goes relatively quick and quicker than it would be if we leave the business as usual with the 2051 date. But also that it's done recognizing national circumstances. So the approach that we proposed is first, we will propose the guidance on how the copper switch-off areas should be designed, because we need here the predictability for everyone. Then national regulatory authorities, which have the best analysis data, will decide which copper switch-off areas are ready for the switch-off based on the criteria that we proposed. And finally, member states at the level of political level will issue the national plans, how to do the copper switch off, what should be replacing, when the fiber is possible. So it's not only focusing on the persistence of the copper networks, but also on planning for fiber deployment. So the copper switch off plans are not only copper switch off plans, they are really looking into how to deploy fiber in the long term and make sure that we meet digital decade targets and beyond, because we'll also look beyond with digital decade targets, and I will come back to this at the end. So this plan, as I said, would be very much done in the preparation, in the cooperation with the member states, NRAs, and the most important partner would be, of course, operators, because it would be you putting fiber into the grant and ducts. Finally, it would be accompanied by revised access regulation. So what we are proposing in DNA is much more focused approach to the access regulation, comparing with what we had so far. We base ourselves very much on the SMP regime, significant market power regime, which, by the way, it has its origin here in the UK regulation. Initially, we believe that it's still very much valid, in particular for the transition period to full copper switch off and full fiber environment, but we are also accommodating situations in the future, which might be also a situation of your companies, that in some areas there might be local monopolies because the copper network will be switched off. Some areas cannot be served by more than one network. So we have to be also prepared and prepare regulators for potential regulation of these areas if it's necessary. So this is what we are proposing with kind of a graduation of the intervention. So the first place, we are very much looking into symmetric rules. I'm talking about Gigabit Infrastructure Act and access to ducts under this act, so which is symmetric regime, and also symmetric rules that we are proposing under the DNA, including with the possibility for the regulators to intervene under the conditions of symmetric regulation, so basically based on the replicability test, which is probably easier than the test that we have under SMP. So that's very important element. Look first at the symmetric rules. On the ex-ante access regulation, so basically SMP regime, it would be much more focused with clear hierarchy of remedies, and very importantly, prioritizing again access to ducts. So we do not exclude that also under SMP regime, if regulators will decide to go this road, there would be need to ensure in first place access to ducts, either as a remedy or as a market itself. For the hierarchy of remedies, I think one thing that is very important to mention, here again, single market is coming back, we proposed harmonized access products. These access products would be as a first ones to be applied by NRAs in case they decide to go for the SMP type of regulation. Why we propose them? We have been analyzing many cases throughout the years. There is such a different approach to remedies in different member states. Sometimes it's justified, sometimes it's not. Very often it's not. So we want to develop these harmonized access products together with NRAs, together with you, so that will be very important task for BEREC. These access products, I think my colleague yesterday, Lucrezia, was explaining it in one of the workshops, would be mostly based on the mass market products. Here I'm talking about unbundling and VULA, business products, Ethernet list lines, and would be connected with what would be recommended in the recommendation on the relevant markets. It doesn't mean that NRAs would not be able to use other access remedies, but then they would need really to prove their case that they need something which goes beyond the harmonized access products. And very importantly, we also, in our proposal, proposed that the remedies which are going outside of harmonized access products will be subject to veto by the Commission. What is also very important with the access regime, we really think that it's time to do relatively quick market reviews. I have seen some that were lasting 5 years. In total and based on very late data, and to accompany already the market reviews with concrete solutions and remedies. Very often we had seen decisions on the designation of the SMP and decision of regulating the market coming after many years of indeed throughout research. And then 2 years later, remedies based on these market reviews. We don't think it's modern approach. We don't think it's good approach for the market. We really would like to see this combined and coming in the same place. So that's a bit in the nutshell the provisions related to fiber, related to the copper switch-off. Very much copper switch-off plans and fiber deployment plans are related with the way we designed access regime, because the access regime needs to cover both the period of transition in some member states to full fiber environment, and then in the future full fiber environment, because we are talking about regulation that hopefully will last for 10 years or so. Last but not least, recommendation on relevant markets is still there. Commission has possibility to issue such a recommendation. The current regulation is still in place, and we also put obligation on us to review regularly if there is a need for issuing in the future recommendation on the relevant markets. Last aspect, which is connected with resilience and critical infrastructure of the networks, which is also relevant for the discussion here and very much relevant to the current situation, unfortunately. We have proposed in the DNA preparedness plan. So basically we propose that together with NRAs, mostly, and BEREC, we will have finally overview of the critical infrastructures across the EU, because whatever incidents might happen, and I hope they will not happen on the EU soil, this would require not the reaction of one member state, it would require the reaction of all member states acting together. So for us, the preparedness plan is a step towards single market connectivity preparedness for any critical incidents that might happen, from cyber attacks to, unfortunately, the physical attacks on the infrastructure, which to some extent we have seen with, in particular, the cable cuts in the Baltic Sea in the past. Last but not least, part of this resilience and sovereignty aspects is indeed Cybersecurity Act, where we look into the security of our networks, making sure that there is a full de-risking in the future, and that also refers not only to the mobile networks, as it was under 5G toolbox, but it also looks into the fixed assets. Not on copper, because we really believe this doesn't make sense to do the risking on copper when the networks are slowly or but surely switch off, but also on the fiber aspects. Here we are proposing, and I think it's very important to work with you, with the industry, what kind of components are necessary to be de-risked, and I think this is something that would be very much discussed, and we are very much looking forward to this discussion and your advice, because you have the experience how to do the risking of the different components and which components are the most risky. And the last but not least, also economic costs versus the risks that would be assessed under the implementing acts that would be coming later on. So the decision to the risk is coming with the CSA, and it also very much focuses on the fixed networks. But very importantly, it would be done in also way that you would be included in this discussion. We will need to assess both which components and how and when the risking should take place, and for that we take into account both the risks and the costs related to that, because of course our goal is not to take out fiber from the ground that had been already there. Our goal is to de-risk the networks, and with that we can do together with you, and I think it's also a very important part of the overall plan. Thank you very much.